Okay, now that we have the database up and running, or the database server up and running, let's go and create some seed data so that we have something to work with and we'll populate these tables. So let's go ahead, and I don't need to save any of those queries, but let's go ahead to Solution Explorer. Inside the auction service, inside the data folder, let's create a new file, and that's not the one I'm looking for. We need to be inside the Solution Explorer, inside, if you're using that C# dev kit, and then inside the data folder we'll get the option to add a new file, and we can pick a class, and this one's going to be called DB Initializer, and this is what we'll use to seed our data. Once again, I'm just going to update the namespace to reflect the physical location the class is located in. And inside this class, we're going to create a static method. So I'm going to say public static void. We're not returning anything from this. And I'm going to say initdb, and we're going to pass it as an argument the web application and specify that name as app. We're using a static method here because this allows us to use this method inside another class without initializing a new class of DB Initializer. That's what the static keyword gives us there. So we need to get access to our DB context in order to add data to it, and where we're going to use this DB Initializer class is inside the startup of our application. In fact, before the application even runs, we're going to be using it here. So we need to get hold of our service, the DB context service, but before we've got the ability to actually inject this service into a class once the framework has got the application up and running. And the way that we'll need to do that is we'll need to create a scope for the service inside here itself. So we're going to say using var scope equals app.services.createScope. And we add the using keyword here because this will allow the framework, once we've finished with this method, to dispose of any of the services we've used inside this scope that we're creating. And then we'll call another method that we don't have yet called seedData, and we're going to pass this as an argument, scope.serviceProvider, and we're going to say get service, and we want to get hold of our auction DB context and add the closing parentheses there. And then we can put our cursor inside seed data, use the quick fix, and say generate method seed data. And this goes ahead and scaffolds the method that we're going to use to actually seed the data into our database. I'll just change auction DB context to context in this case. So now we have our context, we can do things in code to do something with the database. So I'm going to say first of all that we're going to use context.database, and we're going to use the migrate methods, which doesn't come in automatically, but I can use the quick fix and say using Microsoft Entity Framework Core. And if we take a look at the description of the migrate method, this is going to apply any pending migrations for the context to the database, and will create the database if it does not already exist. So it's going to take a look at our migrations, apply any that have not already been applied, and if the database has not even been created at this point, it's actually going to create the database as well, all inside this single command. Following this, we're going to attempt to seed some data in, but we're going to check first of all to see if we already have some auctions in our database. So we're going to say if context.auctions.any, then we're simply going to return from this method, but we'll add a console.writeLine here as well, just for debugging purposes, and say that we already have data, no need to seed, and then we return after that. But if we do not have any auctions in our database, then we're going to seed some auctions. And the way that we can do that is specify var auctions equals a new list of type auction. And then inside here we can go ahead and create a new auction and start filling out the properties for each auction, but that would be incredibly tedious. So I'm just going to say auctions inside a comment there for now and close that off. And then I'm going to say context.addRange and specify auctions. We'll populate in memory. This is Entity Framework is going to keep the auctions that we add in memory when we use the add range, And then if we actually want to update our database, we can use the context.savechanges. And we just need to fill in the gap here, so we've got some auctions to work with. Now, it's quite tedious to write out this kind of seed data. So inside the course assets folder, inside snippets, you should have an auctions seed.txt. And inside here is just a bunch of auctions that we're going to add for cars, of course, because we're a car auction site. So I'm just going to Control A, Control C, go back to the DB initializer class and overwrite this comment with the list of auctions from the clipboard. And there's 10 auctions in here for various different cars of various different prices with various different auction end dates and times. And there should be 10 of them. So if we scroll back down, just make sure there's no errors in this class. And that looks fine. And then we can head over to our program class to actually make use of this. So inside here, just below the map controllers statement, we'll add a try-catch block and we'll specify DB initializer and we'll use the initDB method and we'll pass it the app as a parameter. And if we do get an error, let's just take out system exception and change that to exception E, then all we'll do with the error is just simply log it out to the console. So I'm just going to say console.writeLine and pass in the exception. So with that in place, we should now be able to populate our database with some data. So let's open up the console. We'll need to stop our application from running because first of all, I want to drop the database that we already have just so that we can confirm that when we do restart our application, it's going to create the database and seed the data. So to drop the database, we can use .NET EF database drop. And we should get a confirmation asking if we're sure. And I'm going to say yes. And that's our database gone. But what we should be able to do now is just type in .NET watch. And we should see activity to populate our database with the values that were provided in the DB initializer class. And we can see lots of insert into statements there, which suggests that has worked successfully. And we can further confirm this if we go to the Postgres Explorer. Let's just go up to the auctions and refresh items. And if I say select and select top 1000, then what we should see is a list of auctions, which we can inside there. Don't worry about the null values. We'd expect the winner, the sold amount, and the current high bid to be null, but we can see the other properties inside there for the created at, updated at, etc. And if we take a look at the items and select the top 1000, then we can see that this table has also been populated with the details of the cars as well. Perfect. So now that we have data in our database, we can start to think about how we're going to return this data to the client. And in the next lesson, we're going to take a look at what we're using to shape our data, which is DTOs and AutoMapper.